In this video, I'll be doing some concept design on the rear frame. For each component, I'll discuss all of my design considerations and how I envision it to be in the future. Now, these models are only a concept, so they are very rough. As the bike builds up around it, they will also be developed. Now, there are many features that are required for the manufacturing and the fabrication, which will not be included at this stage, but they will come in later on when it nears more the production level of design. So for now, I will mention some of these features, but I'll be showing them in more detail as the frame develops throughout the project. So currently we can see that I'm updating the brace tubes. Why do I have to do that? Well, it's because I built them using reference geometry for the top and lower tubes. And since making this brace tube, I then made some changes to the upper tube. And since I'd like to follow best practices, the geometry is no longer linked, so I have to recreate that geometry and realign the brace tube. So here we copy in the surfaces from the lower and upper tubes, and then we convert those to DM feature. And just a note, when you do want to convert any features, any surfaces to a DM feature, it's best to move those features to the beginning of the timeline because everything before it will also be converted to the DM feature. And you'll notice that I encounter a strange bug here. What should be happening is I select the surface which is going to be trimming, then I select the surface I want to delete essentially. But for some reason this is reversing the deleted surface, so I actually have to click the surface that I want to keep. So now you can see I'm using the techniques that I covered in a previous video for how to create the notching or the coping in the brace tubes. So the steps for this process, since I'm using surface modeling here, I am taking an offset of the upper and lower tubes. That offset surface is then trimming the ends of my brace tube, and I'm using the internal surface of the brace tube at this point. Once that's been trimmed, I can then offset the surface to get the external surface. But since this is at an angle, it is now going to intersect with the upper and lower tubes again. So we're going to make an additional trim to the external surface, both at the upper and lower tubes. And finally, we'll thicken externally to get our coped tube. Then we can see we have the nice coped form and also an additional bit of clearance. Now finally we need to repeat this on the other side, so we'll just mirror the component across to the left side of the frame. Now there's a whole range of different components that need to be added to the frame here, so I'm going to start with looking at the design considerations. So on the rear frame we're going to have the rider and the pillion. So this will generate some load, so we'll need some general reinforcement of these tubes. There's also the number plate hanger which will have to bolt into the bottom of the frame, as well as the tail light which will have to bolt in at the end. Now the seat isn't floating, so we'll have to build in a seat latch and some feet for it to rest on the frame. And we'll also want some additional hooking feature to keep it more stable. Now the direction of the hook is going to depend on the type of seat and the direction of which it's installed. Now there's quite a lot of space here between the tubes up to the rear tail light, so I would like to build some extra reinforcement in here, especially due to the shape of these tubes. Now a very important load case for the rear frame is also the pillion hangers. Now the load on the hanger actually generates a lot of torsion in the lower tube, so we need to be careful to ensure enough stiffness in the right places. So with the pillion and rider loads on the rear frame, we can get some fairly large stress concentrations if we're not careful with where we reinforce and stiffen the frame. If we stiffen up the rear frame too much, we might increase the stress that we'll see at the outriggers. Again, these outriggers are just placeholders and they will be modified again in the future. Okay, so I'm going to start with the number plate hanger. Now, whilst this could be a simple bracket, I foresee that this is probably going to come a pressing, so I'm just going to call it a pressing from the beginning. The reason for that is that the number plate hanger is fairly long, so with the number plate bouncing around at the end of that, I believe will create a substantial stress in this bracket. So I believe some extra stiffening ribs will be needed. So you see that I'm modeling this with an offset both from the number plate hanger and also from the tubes. Partly for the shape that I'm planning to model, but also because we need to leave space for fixings and rubber grommets. So again, this is all concept at this point, so everything will be modeled very simply, just to try and rough out the shape and get the idea. Now if you want to do something like this in designing your own concept motorcycle, but maybe you don't have anything for reference to build up your idea, then I'd recommend finding some images that you like, a motorcycle roughly the shape and size that you're looking for. And then you can scale that image. I've shown the process in a previous video, and then you can use that for reference as you build your concept. So I decided that I want to have a swept surface which will be parallel to this tube, and in order to do that I want to extrude a surface straight into the tube and then use a trim to create a curve. Now it doesn't actually matter to me which part of this surface remains, because I only need the curve for reference. So now I want to make a swept surface along this curve, and to start that I'm going to create a plane along the path. I'll then sketch my profile. Then we'll sweep that curve along the edge. Now I want to trim all of these surfaces using a single trim, just to make sure that the edges line up properly. You see that I have the straight line continuing past the edge where the two surfaces are going to come together. Now the reason for that is because I want to put a large round between these two surfaces. If I don't leave enough material here, we'll get some strange geometry around the corner. Now I really enjoy the process of modeling 3D CAD. You start with such simple shapes and then it gets more and more complicated as you try to figure out how to make the shape that you're imagining, and putting your imagination onto the computer into 3D space. It's really satisfying when you get to your final results. Now, if anyone has any requests for how they could potentially model any particular parts, please feel free to leave your request in the comment section down below, and I'll see if I can make a tutorial showing you how you can do it. In addition to the bodywork around the end of the rear frame, there's also going to be some plastic infills or plastic moldings which are going to be there to help support other electrical components, maybe the battery, the fuses, ECU. So we're going to have to take that into consideration. with any pressed features that we add in here, it's going to interfere with the packaging space that we have. But we may also need to include some extra fixing locations to help support that load. So we have enough material in this bracket, in this pressing, just in case. So now I have my right hand surface. I can then mirror that across to the left side, stitch the two surfaces together, thicken them for a solid part, now it looks just a little bit too short for the number plate hanger, so I actually extend the end of this surface just to pull it out that little bit further. And then start preparing the holes for the number plate hanger. This whole geometry is very rough, just eyeballing according to the shape of the number plate hanger itself, kind of like a diamond shape in this case. These holes are going to be oversized because the bolts are not going to be clamping directly to the bracket itself. There will be some grommets and some top hats in there as well. Okay, so now I'll be moving on to the seat front pressing, and what I want to include here is an area for some feet for the seat to rest on the pressing, as well as a space for the seat latch. Since there will be a substantial load going through this pressing, we'll need to include some form or some stiffening features. So I'm starting with actually sketching out the profile that I want to have for this pressing, and I will break the constraints so I can modify these sketches more freely. So once my sketch is complete, I can create a patch feature. Then I'll draw on the patch to sketch out the profile that will be the external surfaces of this pressing. I will draft these to around 15 degrees. Actually, I don't like how the ends come to the tube here. It creates a very short bit of geometry. I will probably be changing this. It doesn't need to be rounded over at this point here. Yeah, so I potentially make the outer walls shorter, maybe remove the rounded form as it connects to the frame, but potentially just keep this a straight surface. And then I'll have to add in some features for the seat latch, and then maybe give some extra clearance for any components that may be underneath this pressing later on. Okay, so moving on to the rear pressing, I imagine we'll have some feet from the seat to rest on the pressing. We'll also include a feature or a second bracket attached to this to provide the mounting of the tail light. This is going to have a large amount of load going through it since it's at the very end of the frame with the pillion seated right on top of it. So this one will definitely have some additional form which will work in later, but for now I'm just going to try and get a straight surface connecting to rounded surface, roughly the form of the tubes. Later on, as the seat is designed and developed, I'll be including a latch feature to help secure the seat to the frame, and that latch is most likely going to be here in this rear pressing. I pull the surface of this bracket down below the top surface of the tubes because I'm going to need to provide enough packaging space for the feet on the underside of the seat to then rest on the bracket. So as I'm designing this rear pressing, I can't help but feel like I'm redesigning the Triumph Trident 660 rear frame. I seem to be following the very similar design idea for this pressing. Then I'm going to add an extra bracket on the bottom here, so just going to create a new component within this part to have an assembly, and I'm going to position that part just towards the back of the bracket here. Now again, this is still concept, very rough, so I'm just going to keep it very simple and extrude an L-shaped bracket, and that will provide the mounting for the tail light. I think in order for some of this design to work, I'm going to invest in buying a few components just so that I can design around them and model them more accurately and include them in this model. So for this I may order a tail light and potentially a headlight as well. because my frame tubes are looking a little bit too free at the rear, I'm just going to include a brace tube between the two. So we started with dropping in the component within the assembly, and then moving it to the point, and then rotating and dragging it in free move mode until I get it to roughly the position I want, and then adjust the angles. So considering the current concept of the rear frame, I feel like I'm missing some reinforcement between the lower and the upper tubes, so I will probably extend the lower tube to connect to the upper tube. And then around this area we have a lot of room for metal tabs that can be welded on for the connection of fairings, for example. Then I want to add a brace between the lower tubes just to help resist those torsional loads from the pillion hangers, and also include some bosses to mount the pillion hangers. So I went ahead and made some of the changes that I mentioned, starting with extending the lower tubes to connect to the upper tubes. I feel like I'm already starting to like the shape of the rear frame here. So we also added the brace tube between the two lower tubes, and then also an additional tube to brace between the lower and upper tubes, roughly around the pinch point of the frame, because I think without this we'd have some high stresses around this point when it's under load. So the next thing to work on is going to be the outriggers and the main frame. Also look at the swing arm and the rear suspension system. So if you're interested, please hit like and subscribe, and look out for the next upcoming videos.